All right, so I'm going to talk about licensing and it being specific to here in Michigan and kind of what we've done. So one of the points on licensing is, and of course, my parents have a tough time telling people what I do for a job. So they're like, I don't want to say you work in politics. We'd lose a bunch of friends. I don't know what you mean by you do occupational licensing research. So they just say he's happy and he's got some grandkids for us. So my reports look at licensing specifically here in Michigan and what the effects are. So Jamie gave a great overview. This is how we define occupational licensing. She said government permission to work. So almost always this means government mandating paying fees every year, that you have to have a certain education. You might have to have certain classes within that, certain training hours, and then passing exams. That's generally how it works in Michigan. We license about 175 occupations in the state, and some of those are very restrictive, medical doctors, but those are medical doctors and a lot of health are pretty similar, state to state. And then we also have a lot of ones, not necessarily lower income, but more working class occupations, we compare those. My dad does construction, carpentry, so I grew up in Illinois. Michigan licenses a lot of those occupations that I worked in with my father that we were not licensed in the state of Illinois, so it was always a fascinating thing to me to see how that worked in practice. As Jamie talked about, so in Michigan, about 1% of workers earn the minimum wage, about 13% belong to labor unions, 20 to 25% fall under occupational license. So it is the biggest area that affects most people in the labor market. And we have a lot of studies on the issue. Our past 3 presidents have their labor departments have taken an interest in this. Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, all generally along, a lot of agreement. This is overly restrictive, especially in certain areas. And they try to figure out different ways they want states to analyze this. It is an interesting thing because the regulations are almost all at the state level. Very little federal licensing. There's some requirements in some areas, but it's almost all coming from the states. So Jamie talked about, well, why do we have licensing laws? And it is, on the one hand, there are associations. She talked about they want licensing laws for different reasons, but consumers believe licensing laws protect them. You can see this in survey data. You can see this when you talk to people. So I have presented on this a lot. I've talked with a lot of people about the issue, and they say, well, we need licensing laws to protect us. That is why they go in. If you're a state lawmaker, I promise you, the association will come in and say, we need licensing for protecting public health and safety. Okay, so some of you probably think that. They're like, yes, obviously we're very careful. We have these laws for a specific reason. So the way I found around this is, okay, and when I talk to lawmakers, I know we have Rep. Dave Martin here, I say, here's the questions I have for the associations. If licensing laws are about health and safety, let's see how you guys do. We're bringing you back to high school. We're going to have a little quiz for you. So let's see how you do on how Michigan licenses its occupations. All right, so what are you more concerned about? Are we more concerned about the brakes on our car, or are we more concerned about this old pole barn you have and you need to get that repainted, that you need to repair it? Who's more concerned about the barn? No one? Okay, brakes in your car. Okay, well, state of Michigan, how about the pilot of the airplane you're on? Or the barber cutting your hair? Okay, more concerned about the pilot. Well, the state of Michigan, there's no mandatory education for an auto mechanic. There's private licensing, a lot of them go to. We required, I like this update. So this was a rare license the state got rid of. But we required 60 hours of training, $900 in fees to paint a barn. And you had to be over 18 years old. If you hired a teenager to paint your house or paint your bar, at any point in the last 40 years, you broke the law, unless they had a license. And I don't know if any of you checked. Pilots, so that's 1,500 hours of flight time. This was only 250 hours of flight time until 2013. 1,800 hours to be a barber here in the state of Michigan. 1,500 to be a cosmetologist. 1,500 to shampoo hair in the state of Michigan. I would suggest we don't really spend a lot of careful time thinking about targeting these regulations in the right way. And that's a really major difference. I mean, think about how much money you're making as a cosmetologist or a barber compared to an airline pilot. But you make them go through yes, you're right. All right, I'm putting some of these up. This is a quiz. Let's see how we do. And I just say, lawmakers, you need to pass this. If you're telling me licensing makes this huge safety difference. All right. Carpentry or drywall, which is licensed in the state of Michigan? I'm going to say drywall. You can shout up and want. Carpentry is licensed, not drywall. All right, we're getting there. How about asphalt versus concrete? Asphalt driveway or concrete driveway? Concrete is licensed, no asphalt. Thanks. So we can get a little bit more road work done. Sewer and septic work versus excavation work. Excavation requires a license, not the sewer and septic. Oh, sorry. So the red one is the one that is licensed. So excavation requires a license, not the sewer and septic. Insulation versus plaster. Pretty simple. These have a theme. They're similar type of work. Insulation requires a license. Plaster, you're good. You're good to go. Masonry versus paving. So pavers are kind of the stones you put up together in a house. Masonry. Tile and marble versus carpet. Yep. Tile, marble. Vinyl flooring versus wood flooring. It's tough. So wood floors need the license. So they'll ask you, wait, what type of floors do you need? I need to know who I can send. Fence. Somebody got at me on this. They were very confused. I realized they did fencing, like with swords, in their free time. So they were like, I don't think I have a license for that. So putting up a fence versus siding in a house. So the siding needs a license. So whether you're with the swords or putting up a fence, you don't need the license. Awnings versus roofing. This was a big deal for me. I did roofs. My dad had to know. The roofing needs it versus the awnings on a home. Last one. House wrecking versus house moving. Taking down a house or moving a house. Yeah. So the house wrecking needs it. So a lot of arbitrary licensing and also a lot with what. So, here's the list of those side by side. I mean, this is from the state licensing department. Like, they'll put this up because people had a lot of questions. What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? And it's not just, I push back, it's not about do we totally de-license something or do we license something? That we don't want to get into that. Like, there are some things that need to be regulated and some things that don't need to be regulated, but it's the question over how do we regulate something. In Illinois, when I would build decks, and I build decks in Michigan, if you build decks, you have a requirement at the local level that it's inspected. That's really the important regulation. Me sitting down and doing 60 hours at a computer, that will not teach me how to do a deck. But the state requires that, and then I have to go pass a test. Doing an apprenticeship, learning how to build, and the inspection is really how we should regulate something like that. So this is on a house. The green does not require a license. The red does require a license. But it's not just, it's also how much is something, what does the state require? This is the mandatory hours the state of Michigan requires to do these jobs. You want to open a restaurant? Nope. No mandatory hours. Do you want to be a chef? No mandatory hours. That's doing food preparation, something a lot of people get worried about. We don't require, the state doesn't require you to go to Le Cordon Bleu or go through something. We say you can figure out what kind of restaurants you want. We'll regulate it through the health department in a different way. Private pilot, 40 hours of flight time, and then you can fly people around in a plane. You can start that at 14 years old versus hanging gutters, and an EMT is 200 hours. Consider an athletic trainer. An athletic trainer, so many more. What's that, 20 times the hours to be an athletic trainer versus an EMT? I don't think we spend a lot of time thinking about this. So we talked about the shortage issue. Shortages of teachers and doctors and builders and mechanics and therapists. So Michigan reciprocates licensing really pretty easily with about 32 occupations. If you're a barber in Indiana, you move to Michigan, it's a fairly easy process to go for. It's a little bit more restrictive for some other things. Some things it's really difficult. We've certainly made it easier for teachers, but there are other states that do it much more easily less. But physical therapists, auto mechanics, siding, state of Michigan says, nope, you got to go through and go through. It doesn't matter if you've been working in that for 20 years in Ohio. I don't know what's happening. Maybe the siding is way worse in Ohio. They get really worried. Nope, you got to go through your own rules when you come up here to Michigan. There are states that do it differently. Ohio passed a broad-based reciprocity law. Arizona, automatically. If you have a license in another state and you move to Arizona, boom, you're working. You don't even need the license. If you've been working, because you have some states where Arizona licenses and others don't, or vice versa. I think if you've been working in something for a certain amount of years and you haven't had any problems, let's have you come into Michigan and work in it. I was talking to Rep. Martin, my sister. She married a guy in the Army. She's a teacher. Every time she moves, Pennsylvania, going to Tennessee, going to Washington State, going to Kansas. Now she's in Kentucky. She's got to think about what does she need to do. She's been teaching and doing the same thing for years. Why is she not allowed to just move into a district that wants to hire her and be allowed to work? And I think that's what we should do here in Michigan. So there's 5 main things I think we should do. Did I get it to 4? Okay, 5. So we have done a couple of them. One is we do not allow local governments to do licensing anymore. Previously we did for a long time. We changed this in 2017. So Detroit had 60 occupations. It required its own licenses. You could be a licensed and work as a plumber in Oakland County, but if you went into Detroit, they said, nope, you got to go do your own standards. You had that for a variety of licenses. Bay City requires you to have a license if you want to be a fortune teller. You have a lot of these things like that for some reason. The state said, okay, you can't add new licenses going forward. A big important thing less talked about in this is people with criminal backgrounds. So it's not just requiring the license and not just a background check, but the state would actually, if you had a felony record, they would not allow you to get licensed in most fields. If you had a misdemeanor, very often you would not be allowed to get licensed. They would look at that and hold it against you. I understand that we want to know what people's backgrounds are before we hire them, but the legislation we did, which is something I've been working on for a while, is essentially, I think you should, if the person's criminal background is something unrelated to what they want to work in, if somebody has a drug charge and they did their time, I think they should be allowed to be a roofer. I think that, a person hiring them can still know that, and they can understand that background check. If you're a nurse, it was previously nurses, if you had a felony record, you could not go work in the medical field. And we have changed that through legislation. But if a hospital does a background check, they know what your crime is and says, we want to take a chance on them, I think they should be allowed to do that, and I'm thankful we do allow that now. But then there's other areas we have not done. So the universal recognition. I think Michigan, if people want to come in here and work and they've been working that field and they've done it safely, we should allow them to do it. We did pass some legislation. Rep. Martin has cared about that issue on military, veterans, and their family, or active military. I think we should expand that to everybody. We should review every license. That's the key. It's not about let's review it so we get rid of licenses, but let's make sure those hours actually make sense, or that you can do something through an apprenticeship rather than actually sitting in a classroom or doing something online. And then after that review process, let's set it up to get rid of things that do not make sense. So I'm happy to take any questions at the end.